Table for two, please. Hello, my name's Amy, and welcome back to Table for Two. This is a really special episode for our podcast. This is the first time that we've done any video podcasting, so this is my first time on camera. Hi, everyone. Um, it's also our first episode of 2023. I know you guys haven't heard from us in a while, but we're so excited to keep it up and start strong this year. This is also my first solo episode, the first solo episode on this podcast, as once again, Vegas in college, I'm still stuck in high school, and this felt a bit weird. I had to do a couple takes for the countdown and the intro because usually Viveka leads it. But on to the actual content of the podcast. If you've been keeping up with our Instagram, you know what this episode is all about. For some background, I thought, what better way than to return to sort of our academia days and unpack what gave me academic trauma all along, which is the Gifted and Talented program. And amid the hashtag gifted kid burnout trending on TikTok, as well as a new semester just starting, this is also second semester of junior year, so it's going to be fun. I think it's pretty good timing to talk about this. And did you know, this podcast, we were actually going to be called High School Hotlines. So what better way than to go back to our roots? All right. I think the question that we're really aiming to answer here, or at least discuss, is do gifted programs really benefit students? And it's not my proudest research question, but I sort of see this as more as a general sort of discussion of our personal experiences and our thoughts toward the GT program, which is why I came up with that survey, put it out on Instagram, and we got a lot of thoughtful responses. So throughout this episode, I'm going to be looking back at some of those. And as you guys know, this is also going to be a 3-part series. So for the next following 2 episodes, we're going to be looking sort of more at the gifted and talented part more separately. So very excited for you guys to hear that one. Before we jump into everything this episode has, I want to give the definition of gifted according to there's an actual association for gifted children. It's called the National Association for Gifted Children, which I'm going to refer to as NAGC throughout this episode. So the NAGC defines anyone that's gifted as they actually use the Elementary and Secondary Education Act's definition, which is, quote, students, children, or youth who give evidence of high achievement capability in areas such as intellectual, creative, artistic, or leadership capacity, or in specific academic fields, and who need services and activities not ordinarily provided by the school in order to fully develop these capabilities. With that being said, 6 to 10% of children are quote unquote gifted in the US and would benefit from this accommodating education. And one other thing before we go into just sort of the meat of this episode, I guess, I do also want to mention that I'll be sharing my personal journey through the Gifted and Talented program, as it's something I genuinely have a lot to say about. I'm going to be referencing back to my own experiences throughout the series, so I think it's sort of nice to see, for you guys to see where I'm coming from through all of this. For me, I started the GT education program in elementary school. I was tested in kindergarten, and then I was subsequently enrolled in the first grade. Throughout middle school, I just continued with the program, and in high school, for my underclassmen years, I actually did stay enrolled in the GT program, but this year, which is my junior year, I couldn't continue due to some schedule conflicts. I didn't want to drop another class since that class I actually had to go through a lengthy application and interview for, so I was like, I worked so hard to get here, why would I, not take the class after getting in and getting accepted? And the other class was orchestra, which I didn't want to move to another orchestra or give up orchestra altogether. So, alas, I had to drop the program. So my opinions come from a place where I've been in the program for 10 years, And so it's basically my entire like grade school experience. And I have quite the bone to pick with it. So there are pros and there are cons, but we will get right to that. So, first and foremost, what are the origins of the GT program? So, to give you guys a bit of context of where gifted education and this concept of, you know, intelligent, gifted children came from, I'm going to share some key dates in gifted and talented education from the NAGC. So, starting in 1868, William Torrey Harris, who was the superintendent of public schools for St. Louis, he institutes the earliest systematic efforts in public schools to educate quote unquote gifted students. There wasn't really a way to identify these gifted students per se back then, so I'm not really sure how they did it. But this was the first example of them having gifted schools or gifted programs for students. In 1901, the first school that's especially for gifted children opens. So, with William Torrey Harris, he sort of started just implementing a program, but then now there are schools for these gifted children, which never seen one before. But in 1905, Binet and Simon, who are French researchers, they developed the Binet-Simon test. So you guys have probably heard of this, but it is essentially like the early IQ test. They use it to identify children of inferior intelligence with the goal to separate them from quote unquote normally functioning children. And it's said to quote unquote capture intelligence in a single numerical outcome. So I know hearing this, you guys may already start to think, like, oh, isn't there already kind of a problem with this? Isn't this like not the best way to measure intelligence? Because again, I think most of us know that there are so many different ways that people can be intelligent, and you can't consolidate that into a single numerical number. But I guess they thought they were onto something. So um, in around 11 years later, in 1916, Louis Terman, who is dubbed the father of the gifted education movement, he goes and he publishes the Stanford Binet test, which is a revised version of the Binet-Simon. So, and this later leads to William Stern creating the intelligence quotient, which is what we know now as IQ. So, what you can really take away from these things is that the concept of these more intelligent, gifted children came before tests to really determine how that comes about or how you identify that. And the implementation of this gifted programs and gifted education, it was really gradual. So, thus, it was never mandated by anyone, or there was never an established standard either. So, with that being said about GT programs in the past, what do they really look like today? Now, I did a lot of research and I tried to find if there was any like national standard for GT education or sort of some similarities, but the NEGC actually claims that, quote, gifted and talented students and those with high abilities need gifted education programs that will challenge them in regular classroom settings, and enrichment and accelerated programs to enable them to make continuous progress in school. Sounds like education. Um, but then they continue and say, quote, although federal law acknowledges that children with gifts and talents have unique needs that are not traditionally offered in regular school settings, it offers no specific provisions, mandates, or requirements for serving these children. Currently, gifted education is a purely local responsibility and is dependent on local leadership. So, is it safe to say that there really is no mandatory sort of gifted education? What is the difference between different gifted programs in different schools and different districts? So, it was a little bit shocking to hear that because you hear so many people talking about the GT program and how like pristine or whatever it is, and it's really up to your local leaders to decide what that looks like. So, it's really interesting because a lot of people, when they talk about the GT experience, they also have very similar thoughts. So, just something to think about. Now, I'll dive into a little bit of my personal experience and how the GT program looked like from the schools that I grew up going to. So, once again, I started in elementary school. I started in the first grade. And honestly, that was when I remember GT being the most fun. But we would do a lot of breakout boxes, we would do brain games, and that was when we first really started doing a lot of projects as well, which is ironic considering now I go to a very project-based learning campus. But we did a lot of things like building your own kingdom And within that, we would start talking about, what's your government, what's your everything, and we even talked about just civilization in general. And we learned about different number bases, like base 9, base 8, and we learned about all of these like sort of mathematical, really logical things. Um, I remember we read the Mysterious Benedict Society because it was also about quote unquote gifted children and whatnot. And honestly, I think these projects made us think a lot. Uh, it really made us use our imagination and really think about the world around us. And we had the opportunity to be really creative and just have fun. And the reason I say this is the years of GT where I feel like I really felt the most accepted and felt the most carefree was because like we were young. Everybody was friends. There was no sense of like academic competition or whatnot. And we really just had fun. I feel like this is the only time that the GT program was really rewarding to me because I would get pulled out of a class that, I'm sorry to my elementary school teachers, but I didn't necessarily enjoy sitting on the carpet for like 30 minutes and writing on a worksheet. And I'd get pulled out of class and I'd instead get to learn about all these cool different things I don't learn in school regularly. And I get to really connect with my peers, like no judgment. It was just pure learning, pure fun. And I think our teacher also had a really big thing to do with that. She really encouraged us to be ourselves, and she made one of the most profound impacts on my life. She was really fun with all the students. Like she always knew, like oh, what'd you do on the weekend? And she shared with us some really funny stories with us, and she really just has a special place in my heart. So, Miss Sinclair, if you're out there, I miss you, and your class was the favorite part of my elementary school experience. But yeah, it was really the only time I felt like, oh, where GT wasn't associated with uh, academics, at least as much for me. And then going on to middle school. I had amazing teachers in sixth and eighth grade. I think the only reason I didn't really like my seventh grade teacher was because she had no experience teaching the gifted program. By this point, the GT program started became more integrated with English and reading and writing. So there wasn't as much as that like fun math logic aspect with breakout rooms and whatnot, but we still did a lot of like fun projects. Um, it was more of creative projects. We did do like the writing and reading novels every semester because it was like required. And we studied one of the things I can remember the most clearly from that middle school time was that we studied a lot of like word stems, such as like prefixes and suffixes, and we would memorize them and we'd have tests over them. So no other English class did this at my middle school, but I guess it was just something for the GT kids or whatnot. It helps me in later classes, but I'm not sure why they decided to do that just for the gifted program. So honestly, this was just a lot like I wouldn't say regular English classes in middle school. It was still very project based, but we were learning sort of the same concepts and we were just adding in fun projects with that, which I think why I was so I was able to so easily adapt to the project based at my current school. So I guess I have my middle school experience to thank for that. As for high school, our GT program works a little bit like this. So in your freshman and sophomore year, if you decide to continue with the GT pathway, you would be in this class called GT Humanities. So essentially, what would happen was that it would count for English credit in freshman year, and you would teach one half of AP World History while doing that. It was just sort of, it was only one class period, and it was just like you had to take like another social studies credit to go with it. But then in sophomore year, it would count for your AP World History credit, and then they teach the other half of AP World History, and then you'd have to take English too with that. So it essentially was just AP World History split into two different years, which you would think it would help us a little bit more to understand more of the content in depth and help us more on the AP test, but because this was a GT program, they weren't necessarily teaching for the AP test. We were still doing projects. Once again, it's a project-based campus, so at this point it was like, oh, there's no difference. But I don't think it really helped with the AP test itself. The only time we actually started doing AP test prep was in like the month leading up to the AP test, where the sophomores would split up and they'd go and do their own like AP review units, write their DBQs and stuff. It was a tough time. But I actually started, as a freshman. That was the year where we had Zoom school. So I started off learning the second half of AP World History. So it was like units 5 through 8 or however many it was. And somehow made it through. I actually took the most notes of my life during that time. And then I would learn like units 1 through 4 or something in my sophomore year. So they didn't really like stop the years. It was just like, oh, whichever year you landed in, you just started in that half of history. But I honestly think the GT program really provides great teachers. I have really fond memories of both my freshman and sophomore year GT teachers. I still keep in touch with them, and they make the biggest impact on my life. All right, that's enough said about my experience and just how I grow up thinking what GT programs look like. And a lot of people said it was a similar thing, just a lot of project based, a lot of deeper thinking and things like that. So I'm assuming it's just sort of like that universally. So now I want to touch on some of the pros of the GT program because although there are like a lot of people have a bone to pick with it, including me, which we'll get to later and I'll tear the program apart basically. But there are still some pros that are, sort of suggested by studies and things like that. So, there is a positive self concept of being labeled quote unquote gifted. So this actually comes from a theory called the big fish, little pond theory. So essentially what this is that a person who is very well known or very important in a small group of people, but who is not known or important outside that group or group of students in a higher achieving schools will in turn compare themselves with their peers and consider themselves less capable, while equally performing students in a lower achieving setting, they'll have more confidence in that. So essentially, in terms of like GT students and GT kids, when they're placed in a classroom with non-gifted students, these gifted students, they achieve academically more and they feel better when doing so than compared to their quote unquote non-gifted peers. And a lot of people also said this in our survey was that they felt like sometimes GT kids had this sort of special or superior attitude because they were labeled gifted. And in my opinion, the younger you are put into the GT program, the more the fact instilled to you that you're special or you're superior to other people because you're more intelligent, you're more gifted, things like that. And that can also be a con, which we will also get to that later. Another thing is that the GT program provides academic challenge. 80% of those currently in GT programs say this is the reason they joined, based off the results of the survey. Um, a lot of people also said the class content is more quote unquote holistic and it's not the same as your regular on level or pre AP classes. There's a lot of mentions of quote less busy work and more personal interpretation, and this academic challenge also makes people think they're capable of and expected to do above and beyond expectations that people have of them and that they put on themselves. Now, students identified as quote unquote gifted in K through 12 grades, they actually go on to pursue higher levels of education. So there's also a higher level of doctorate degrees associated with gifted kids. And I think that really comes from the expectation for ourselves to sort of keep on learning and keep on achieving high academically, because that's what's been instilled to a lot of GT kids since they were a young age, is to do well in school, do better in school than everyone else. A lot of GT students also say they, quote, become close friends with like minded students, bond with their teachers, and they believe that the curriculum has helped them think deeper about their surroundings. And I can understand where this is coming from. They become close friends with students that also are very high academically achieving, which, is very good if you want to motivate yourself to do more academically, and it's a really good thing. Um, they also bond with their teachers. Again, a lot of these GT teachers, at least from my experience, they're some of the most like funny, like understanding people, like teachers. All of my favorite teachers are essentially from when I was enrolled in the GT program and whatnot. And I do believe that the curriculum is requires a lot more creative thinking and logical thinking and introspection, which is why it sort of helps us make these big decisions in life or think deeper around the things about the things around us. Now, despite all of that, I think you could already tell in the hint of my voice that some of these things I believe, while they're good, looking at them just from where we are, they have pretty detrimental consequences to these gifted children. So, diving into the cons of the GT program. Um, from a social standpoint, minority children and those of low socioeconomic backgrounds are underrepresented in gifted programs. Especially African American, Hispanic, and Native American children, they're underrepresented at least 50% or more in these gifted programs. Areas that aren't as wealthy will also not have as many gifted programs compared to well funded or wealthy schools. Um, so I'm lucky enough to grow up in a place that was what had a well funded GT program, which is why I think I'm able to have so many great experiences from it. There's also a lot of teacher bias in the GT program. So, a Vanderbilt University study found that a high scoring white student was twice as likely to a similarly high scoring black student to be identified as gifted by a non black teacher. And this bias actually disappears when the teacher was black. So, this really contributes to that underrepresentation of minorities in the gifted program. Now, moving on to the mental health aspect. Around 20% of gifted children suffer from perfectionism to the degree that it causes problems in their everyday life. And I think this is perfectionism is just the want to n- do everything perfectly. Otherwise, it's not worth doing and it's not worth presenting to the world. And I think a lot of GT students have that ingrained into them that because they're expected to do so much better, they expect themselves to do high quality work all the time. And I think it's as I got older and I got, further along into school that I realized I can't put my 100% into everything I'm doing. Sometimes 90%, 80% is more than enough. I think a lot of GT students expect that because my 100% is so much higher than everybody else's 100%, I need to go above and beyond just to meet that. And I think that's really what causes so much perfectionism and whatnot in GT students. Now, there's also a negative self-concept of being labeled quote unquote gifted, and this is that other part of the big fish, little pond theory, which again is when you're like, if you're in a small group of people, you might be the smartest in the room, but then once you open the doors and you're out on the street, it's like, I'm the same as everybody. Gifted children, their self esteem can suffer when they no longer have an academic advantage over their peers. And many responses from our survey also mentioned GT students being tryhards and labeled as smart. So here are two quotes that I've pulled from the surveys. So, and this was a question regarding stereotypes of GT kids. There's quote, yes, there are stereotypes, such as being sleep deprived, spread too thin between too many classes, and extracurriculars, aiming to go to a top college, very academic and grades oriented. Another person said, quote, they're readers, they're motivated by academic validation, they sacrifice sleep for work, they're procrastinators and high achievers. Which I honestly think that these are really accurate. Um, Me personally, yeah, I am sleep deprived. Um, and a lot of times, because of that high achieving academic focus mentality, yeah, a lot of GT students take a lot of challenging courses. Um, Everybody aims to do well academically, so they're aiming to go to these pristine like colleges at this point, like UT Austin and things like that are also considered super good. And a lot of times like GT kids, yeah, they're literally comparing their grades in class. Like I won't even lie. And definitely motivated by academic validation, and that's why people sacrifice sleep for work. They often overload themselves with a lot of difficult things to show that I can do it. I believe that I can do it, even though it's taking away from their sleep and their mental health and personal well-being. And it's true that a lot of GT students, they do procrastinate a lot, and that's what leads to the perfectionism issue. But That's a whole conversation for another day. Another con is that parents will push their children even harder if they believe that their child is gifted. So the expectation of their parents, when they see their children working easily on everything, it leads to a lack of understanding or sympathy if that student starts to struggle with a specific area. And I honestly feel like that sometimes has happened to me before in terms of I think my parents expected me to do a lot better in math than I do. It's not that I necessarily struggle with it, but I'm not incredibly good at it or anything outstanding. I'm average, and even then, I'm still learning a lot of things. Um, and I think there was like some form of sort of disappointment or just sort of like, oh, we kind of expected you to learn that and pick it up easily. And I just sort of got like a little weird comments when it's like, oh, why don't you get that, you know? And I think it happens for a lot of GT students as well. When there's an expectation for you to be good in so many things and so many things come to you so easily, you expect yourself to be able to pick things up quickly. And so by all means for that, you don't develop those good study habits or you don't develop a good way to learn or things like that. And that actually leads into my next con. Being labeled quote unquote gifted may lead to a lack of work ethic. Since the tasks come so easily at a young age, again, you don't build up that foundation that you need in order to really study and really hone in on those like time management skills and determination and things like that. You're just like, oh, everything comes easily to me, so why do I need to study? But of course, again, many gifted, former gifted kids on TikTok, they've mentioned how they never developed positive work ethic because they were do everything easily as a kid, and now they struggled in high school and college and beyond. Um, and it also comes from a place of that academic validation compared to this. When you're so used to getting high grades without much effort, and then now you're failing to maintain that expectation of yourself, it really messes with your mind and thinking, oh, am I actually smart? Am I actually gifted? Or am I just average? Like, what happened? And this also leads to a lot of imposter syndrome. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard that term before, but essentially it's the persistent inability to believe that one's own success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own effort or skills. I personally think that I suffer with a lot of imposter syndrome. A lot of times when I make achievements or whatnot, while I'm doing that task itself, I'm always just thinking of the negatives. Like, I should have started on this sooner and I would have been able to do a lot better. Or when I'm playing my instrument, it's just like, that sounded really off. I don't know why they didn't mark points off. And when you get that positive feedback back from like peers and teachers and whatnot, you're like, I'm not deserving of all of this. I don't see where you see the good in the things that I do. It really just happened out of pure luck. A lot of times I'm thinking I was just lucky then. Actually didn't really try because I feel like I didn't because I'm not going at 100%. And there's also leads to this conflict of identity, which is what somebody mentioned in the survey, and I felt like it was really important to include. It was a sort of I'm not average, but I'm not intelligent. And it's sort of that sort of jarring shift to be like sort of recognizing that you're not what these people claimed you are. At least you don't think that you're gifted, you don't think that you're intelligent because that's the label. Especially if you join the GT program at a younger age, that's the thing that's been sort of shoved upon you. You're told that you're so special, you're so intelligent, you're gifted, you're going to do amazing things. And once you fail to reach that expectation, because obviously as a kid you're eating that up. You're like, I am gifted, I am intelligent, I can do all these things. But then once you fail to meet that expectation because you start getting burned out, things happen in life and you're not able to maintain that, you're like, what happened? They said I was gifted and why am I not anymore? And then just the final con. I don't think there's a definite way to define in which children are gifted. Um, these handwritten standardized tests, I don't think it's a good way to determine if a kid is gifted or not. And there's not even a formal definition of gifted that really makes sense to me. Just saying that, oh, these children need special education, like, in what aspects? There's so many questions that I have about the definition itself and just how gifted children are identified, you know? And now I'm going to move on to sort of some discussion questions that popped up in my head and some that were included in the survey, and sort of share people's quotes and share sort of some of my thoughts as well. So, first question was one included in the survey. Is there a feeling of otherness or distinction associated with being part of the GT program? And here's the first quote. Quote, I'm sure it's all depending on the individual, but GT kids tend to judge other GT kids in a particular way after knowing that they're part of the GT program. I think this is true. I think the higher up the grade you go, you start to think of GT kids as other like high achieving competition. You start to think of them as your direct competition because like you, they're highly academic achieving. You guys are all set on doing great things. You're all set on being like I'm intelligent, I'm gifted. And so you guys are really competing against each other to do the best that you can. And it sort of becomes a very judgmental place. Second quote. Yes, to some extent, I think there is. Especially in middle school, a lot of GT students would feel special or different for being in GT, and I feel like a lot of students kind of had a superiority complex because they were in GT. However, I think this was lessened in high school because non GT students could just take AP classes that fulfilled the same credits as GT classes if they wanted to. I don't agree with this. I think in middle school, when we were first introduced to the concept of like on level, advanced or pre AP, and then GT, we would have that tier list set up with like on level at the bottom, then it's like pre AP, and then the GT kids. And I definitely think that was sort of just the perception of GT a lot of people had. But then I do agree that now in high school, it's like, oh, it doesn't really matter if you're in GT or not because I'm getting the same credit. But I feel like still having that label, you're still subconsciously sort of putting the GT program on a pedestal in a way. And then the last one, quote, I think some GT kids think they're better than everyone else. I'll leave that one up for audience interpretation. I don't really have much to say about it because I feel like I already went on a whole spiel about it, about how, yeah, there sometimes is a superiority complex because you're involved in such like a high achieving program and whatnot. But yeah, a lot of times it leads like GT kids to think they're academically better than everybody else. And once again, it's just academics isn't the only way to define a person. Now, there's also a lot of stereotypes of GT kids and non-GT kids, and I pulled just of one quote that I felt really stood out with me on this one. And they're just referring to GT stereotypes as a whole. Quote, although it's usually just jokes and a silly stereotype, I do agree with it. There's one specific joke where someone compared gifted kids to a burning candle, and so basically, when the candle is finally out and unable to be lit, and that kind of represents the life of a gifted kid. There's also another sort of stereotype where gifted kids are still gifted. It's just that now they don't use this gifted potential because they are burnt out. I feel like this also comes from a place where our elementary school teachers, if you've been in the GT program since you were elementary school, you were really encouraged and you had a lot of positive talk coming from that teacher saying, like, affirming that, yes, you are gifted, you are intelligent, you are all these things, and you are meant to do amazing things because you're in the GT program, you tested into it, things like that. And I do agree, like, because you're achieving at such a high level and you're pushing yourself to do that so much as a young kid, you get so burnt out by the time you reach like end of middle school, throughout high school, even to college and beyond. Like I agree with that sort of burning candle, not theory, but sort of visualization of GT kids. And it's just that I think a lot of GT kids are left thinking like, I can literally do this, but they're sort of just stuck like, I physically can't because I'm burnt out. And they just feel like they need to because they're capable of it and more. And they just feel like they're not using their potential because you're burnt out. And this is just one of my points. It's very hard to change the label of gifted and ungifted. I feel like especially once you're labeled, I know I keep coming back to the fact, but I feel like the more you instill that point into a very young child, the more ingrained it is into sort of their subconscious and just the way they perceive themselves. Like, it's really consequential. It's like, it really affects them in the future. And once you're labeled as like gifted as a kid or non-gifted, I feel like you sort of subconsciously sort of make yourself live up to that expectation. It's really hard to get out of that mindset once it's been sort of ingrained in your mind that, oh, you're gifted or you're not gifted. And it's all because of a test or an evaluation that you don't really see a person for who they are from a paper test, is my opinion. What if a student misses the exam cutoff by 1 or 2 points? Are they like, they're just not gifted anymore? they were so close to the cutoff. Are they gifted? Semi gifted? There's literally no answer to this. It's just you're gifted or you're not gifted. And I don't think that's right. So, and there's also the a lot of questions about just does giftedness carry on? If you're tested in first grade for being a gifted kid, are you still going to be gifted in eighth grade? Because people test into the program like throughout like elementary school, throughout high school. So where is a kid identified as gifted? What is that age? So just some things to think about. And to sort of wrap up this episode, I just wanted to talk a few more about just some of the takeaways that I have from my personal experience and how I've reflected on my time in the GT program and what I feel like it's really, done to me as a person. There's just one question that I want all the listeners and myself to really think about is, did the GT program do more good or harm to your concept of self? I think in terms of my experience, it it helped me when I was younger. It was really a motivator, and sometimes now it still is, but it is a very toxic mindset. And I think if I was never labeled as gifted, I feel like I would have been more proud of I would be more proud of where I am today and what I'm able to achieve. But because I was given that label, I will always feel like I'm never enough. Um, and like I said earlier, when I mentioned the pros, yeah, it's good that you're surrounded by like minded people, but I only think that's a good thing if you do that voluntarily. Like when you're a little kid, if you're forced into this high achieving 100% lock in working environment since you're a kid, it's not good. It's sort of subconsciously, like as a kid, as like a 6-year old, when you're thrust into that environment, you just think that, oh, like these are the like-minded people I'm around, I'm supposed to be like-minded like them. And of course you also have that internal drive to do well academically, but I feel like being in that environment just like makes you feel like, oh, I need to do just as well and even better academically, and I need to work even harder and things like that. um and one person did mention that GT didn't really affect their social life outside of, school and all, but it did make their schedule be with the same people all day. So they don't really know anyone who has never been in GT because of that. And I feel like it's really important, especially in these very formative years of our life, to be, friends, to know people that, aren't the most like minded as you. Obviously, like the friends and the people you choose to surround yourself with, yeah, choose people who like you agree with and make you feel happy. But I think it's important to be exposed to people from different backgrounds and different perspectives that, once again, due to underrepresentation and sort of that very similar mindset, you don't really see in GT programs. And I strongly agree with whoever put this in the survey. They said, quote, I strongly believe that GT programs should not even be a thing when you're little, or honestly ever. It just causes unnecessary competition, self-doubt, mental health issues in the long run, because everyone is intelligent, and a test to get you into some programs should not be able to determine whether you are or not. I 100% agree with this. A test can't determine just like your intelligence in life. There really is no point in the GT program other than just trying to separate students even more. And I understand that's important for, teaching students at different levels, but is it really necessary to create a whole program and label for this? Now, with my final takeaways, I actually wrote this spiel very late at night. So, but I think that's good because that's where, my strongest emotions and my most honest self comes out. So, I'll just read this spiel to you. It's quite long. Although I left the GT program due to schedule conflicts, I'm still very glad that I was not in it this year. I recognize now that a lot of the harmful habits I've developed in regards to academics stem from that pressure and environment that the gifted program instilled to me at a very young age. I was constantly told that I was special and gifted and talented when I was younger, and it felt like I didn't have to work to make it happen. But, as the curriculum gets harder, understandably due to grade levels and going up from elementary to middle to high school, I'm unable to catch up in terms of developing solid study skills and a good working mindset because I never had to do so as a kid. I get along just fine, but it's like I could do so much better if I did. And if I start failing now, then, I'm not really gifted, am I? Because how can I be doing worse than I was in elementary and early middle school if I can't live up to what other people think of me and stay ahead of my peers, or at least just with them? Then what was all that work for? What do I do it all for? Being in an environment with like-minded people is good, like I said, but only when you choose those people yourself. We were too young for that when we were shoved in the program, and especially for people put into it in early elementary. I only realized how much that high achieving environment really affected me until my last year in the program. We were 5 years old and having this label of gifted smacked onto us. And like, I guess for a lot of parents, that's like a really good thing. But like for the kid in the long run, like from my experience, I wish that never happened. In the survey, all of those that were previously enrolled in the program were in since early elementary, so those very formative years, kindergarten through second grade. Those that are currently enrolled had like 80% joining in middle or high school. And I think it's a totally different experience if you've been in the program since you were in a child, like a literal child versus like a teenager. And the people that have been in it since they were the program as a kid at a younger age, they tend to have more conflicting experiences with it. And it extends like way more than academic life. It goes into their overall mindset and really how they perceive themselves. Um, being shoved into a constantly shoved into this high stress, high performance atmosphere every single school day, 5 days a week for 2 to 3 hours each day, especially in the past 5 years. I was in the program, it was extremely difficult. And it's true, like, I'm not gonna try to disprove it, but the majority of GG kids, they want to succeed. And in turn, they have very high standards of themselves that, they voice to others. So a lot of times when I was in that classroom, I just hear your like SAT scores. I hear, oh my God, I got a 95. That's terrible. My GPA is going down. I'm literally failing. Things like that. And like by hearing that, I was just like, I thought that was okay. Like, what do you mean? Like, I always felt like I could never compete. Um, and I was falling behind and I was a failure, and everything I ever did just amounted to nothing. The gifted program, it really honestly, to say it in the kindest way possible, it destroyed my purpose of self and it just made me extremely burnt out. Um, I adapted to that environment by scrutinizing just every decimal on my transcript. I stayed up or not sleep for like nights in a row just to make everything look perfect and stand out. And I believe that like I should always be productive every waking moment of my life. Otherwise, I was wasting it. Because if I'm capable of going above and beyond, like, why can't I do that anymore? I can't remember the last time that I actually took a break because every single time that I'm not doing work, um, I think about all the things that I have to get done, and therefore, like, I don't get a release from the stress at all. Like, instead, I trap myself in situations where I physically can't do work. I'm like self sabotaging. I'm forcing myself to procrastinate, which is such as, long car rides with like 2 bars of data. I just make myself go on those with my family. I cook dinner for my family. Um, I turn to a task that requires just less effort or something less difficult to get started. So either playing my viola or organizing my Finder folders, things like that, or cleaning my room. And honestly, right now, I'm procrastinating things by making this podcast. But right now, I'm sort of at this standstill of a mindset. It's not like I can take a break because junior year, everything's hitting me like a truck. So I can't actually heal from my burnout and refresh myself. Winter break just happened, but I was either stressing out or doing work. I hung out with people like 3 times. Um, I've been in this state for months, maybe even years, but I guess my final takeaway of just gifted education and whatnot is that maybe the curriculum and the teachers and the students, they're not fully to blame for all of these unforeseen or unpredicted consequences, but it's that culture that they create in little kids 5 years old that sticks with them throughout their entire lives. And they're setting them up for something bigger than success and perfection. And they're getting shocked when they can't handle the pressure in the future. And that's really just what I think about the GT program. For me, yeah, I will say I used to have a very positive outlook on it. I felt like, wow, I'm being academically challenged, but as these years have passed, I've just realized it's done a lot more damage than good. I feel like I'd be a lot more confident in myself, more proud of myself, and I would give myself a lot more credit if I was never labeled as gifted. So, what are your thoughts? If you guys are gifted kids or former gifted kids, what are your thoughts and opinions on it now after hearing this episode? Have they changed, or have you agreed or disagreed with this all along? But with that being said, all the sources that I used to sort of research the stats and information for this episode will be linked in the description below. And with that being said, my name is Amy. I'm signing off.
Check, please.